All right, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Schlossman, and we're live from our virtual studios around the world, or at least here in the state of California. This is the UC San Diego Learning Boost Series, Season 1, Episode 1, recorded on January 26, 2021. The Learning Boost Series is a UC San Diego virtual series of talks introducing you to leaders, dreamers, innovators, and change champions. This series is designed to inspire you with ideas that matter to you and your world, one talk at a time. Today's talk is Cultivating Courage and Connection with our champion for well-being, Izabel Caetano Francy. If you are listening live, then we would love to have you join us in the chat with your questions and comments. Please share your questions and comments in the chat, and at the end, we plan to pose a couple to our featured speaker. If you're watching the recorded version on YouTube, then we ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. Again, today's talk is Cultivating Courage and Connection with our champion for well-being, Izabel Caetano Francy. Izabel is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is an expert behavioral therapist and facilitator. Izabel also has a certification in perinatal mental health. She leads the UC San Diego Working Mom Support Group and the Parent Support Group. She is passionate about teaching the research-backed, brain-based benefits and practices of mindfulness and self-compassion. Let's give a warm welcome in the chat to Izabel.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining this morning, taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us. And we've got a really great presentation planned. Hopefully, we're going to run through it, and then we'll have an opportunity for you all to ask questions. I'm Izabel Caetano Francy. Like Linda mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also certified in perinatal mental health, and I'm a therapist with the Faculty and Staff Assistance Program. That is a unit of campus HR. So here's our agenda for today. As you can see, we're here to talk about courage and connection. What is courage? What is connection? How are they related to each other? What are things how are they different from other related or similar concepts such as self-esteem? And how do we identify these aspects within ourselves as psychological and behavioral processes? And lastly, of course, how do we cultivate or strengthen these types of characteristics? But first, why? Why bother having this conversation? Well, certainly under the most recent circumstances, I don't know about you, but I've been hearing a lot of buzzwords, things like courage, resilience, connection, compassion, empathy, inner strength. You may find that I actually, throughout this conversation and throughout this presentation, use these words interchangeably. And my hope is by the time our conversation is over, that you'll have a glimpse into the beginning to understand why I use them interchangeably. As inevitable, in my opinion, and maybe you'll see some of the research that backs this up, is that they're all part of the same psychological and emotional behavioral cycle. I think to start off, maybe we can create some foundation, and ultimately we'll agree that human suffering on some level is inevitable. Maybe we can mitigate that sometimes by engaging or having access to various external resources like finances or social networking. But external resources won't necessarily diminish or limit the internal experience of suffering or struggle that we all face as humans. Additionally, sometimes we might notice that our suffering is actually being caused by internal patterns. And these internal patterns can sometimes feel impossible to break. It's really common to think that internal patterns are actually out of our control. However, by the end of this presentation, hopefully you will be convinced that that is not true. This is actually an illusion of the mind. We, in fact, know from science that when we bring awareness to internal patterns, when we can observe our own behavior non-judgmentally, and we use non-judgment in order to bypass shame and the resulting psychological resistance or avoidance that comes from shame, that this stance of non-judgmental observation actually leads to an increase in understanding, an increase in clarity, familiarity, and flexibility. When we have this flexible and familiar approach, we're able to create opportunity to open the mind's eye to different options that we never realized were available to us when we were caught up in an automated pattern of the mind. So consciousness or awareness actually leads to these opportunities where we can create a shift, and then we find ourselves empowered and capable of change. Additionally, when we can find ourselves in this position of maybe empowered capability, one of the opportunities that becomes available to us is connection. We're actually wired for connection. This, in my opinion, is the ultimate human longing, and a great deal of research currently supports this. Other people may use words like passion, purpose, meaning, fulfillment, but in my opinion, the bottom line is the overarching umbrella of all these concepts is that we want to feel connected. We want to feel connected to people, to those around us, to our families, coworkers. We want to feel connected to our work, to our supervisors, maybe. We want to feel connected ultimately to as much as we can around us. It's really important for the human mind to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel understood, to feel validated, and have a sense of community. We also, of course, want to be connected to our goals. We want to be connected to our actions in the present moment. And oftentimes in my line of work, we see when people become misaligned or disconnected for an extended period of time, this ultimately causes a lot of discomfort. And the discomfort or internal conflict, when we become so uncomfortable and with so much internal conflict, especially for an extended period of time, this forces us to look at that. And hopefully that creates an opportunity for change. Whether it's around the people, whether it's changing in how we're relating to the people around us, changing in how we're thinking about our goals or interacting in the present moment or behaving in our everyday actions. I can tell you again from a professional standpoint, because no matter what the issue that's coming to me in a particular appointment is, the bottom line is people are looking to feel reconnected with somebody or people or themselves or their goals. And the idea here is when we feel connected or reconnected, when we remind ourselves how to reconnect, we feel at ease, we feel whole, we feel satisfied, and more importantly, we feel like we're able to more capably navigate whatever comes our way, especially difficulties and all the problems that life eventually will throw at us. But let's briefly talk about some of the research before we get deeper into the concepts. So at one point, when self-compassion first came out, cynics often dismissed it as sort of touchy-feely and irrational, but researchers have actually started to map the biological basis in the brain for compassion, suggesting that it has a deep evolutionary purpose. Research has already shown that compassion manifests very clearly in certain physiological responses, such as a slow heart rate, an increase in the bonding hormone called oxytocin. And we've found that when people are in MRIs, that the regions of the brain linked to empathy, caregiving, and feelings of pleasure actually light up. What happens is when these physiological responses ultimately result in us wanting to approach and care for other people, as well as allowing others to care for us. The most obvious example of this is in mammals, especially during the birth cycle. Mammals are all biologically programmed to do caregiving during birth. Infants are biologically programmed to attach to their caregivers, and the caregivers are biologically programmed to attach to infants. And we call this in the psychological process attachment and attunement. And we know when there's difficulty during these processes that the long-term results can be very complicated. So bottom line is here, we're wired for connection. And while we may not find ourselves constantly capable of connection, it is part of our basic humanness. So let's talk about the 3 elements of self-compassion that have been identified as essential. First one, kindness. When we can respond to ourselves and create an inner dialogue that is centered around understanding in response to our moments of suffering when we fail, understanding and kindness, when we feel inadequate, or when we're suffering, this is one step in the direction of what it means to be resilient in the face of adversity. Humans are, of course, imperfect, and therefore we encounter failure. We encounter difficulties. It's inevitable. So when we can step away from that and see this as part of our humanity and not as an internal personal flaw, there's something wrong with me, right? When we can depersonalize a little bit, we create the emotional and psychological state, which enables growth and forward movement versus defensiveness, right? One of the concepts that I really like to talk about is this idea of entitled mind. The mind is super tricky. It prefers, of course, to be in control as often as possible. Who doesn't like a little bit of control? We all do. And part of how humans feel in control is by predicting. Predicting helps us feel significantly in control. However, there is a big difference in predicting and having options and planning for some kind of worst case scenario and feeling like, okay, I have things covered, versus thinking about a worst case scenario, planning for a worst case scenario, and then turning that into what you believe will happen. Those two things are very different, right? So this isn't control. When you're in the mindset of this worst case scenario will happen, we've left reality. We're starting to fantasize, or maybe delusional, whatever word you want to use. This isn't control, right? Ultimately, we got to bring it back to what actually is in our control. And the truth to that is maybe very few things, but if we focus on them, that helps center and ground us. So what are those two things? Maybe it's arguable, but for me, those two things are, one, how we react to things, right? What we choose to do. And two, what we focus on with our mind. And even those two things take a great deal of practice. And the more one practices, the more consistently we can be empowered. There's another thing that you can control with learning, your breathing. You can learn to control your breathing, right? This helps regulate the physiological state. Ultimately, what we're talking about here, and eventually when I want to try to make some links for everybody, is if we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable and step towards emotions that are sometimes uncomfortable, this is going to show us the other side of the coin, which is courage. Brene Brown is a pretty popular author now, researcher. She's a social work researcher out of UT Houston. She has several books, TED Talks, maybe some of you have already heard of her, lots of articles, and now a podcast even that have become very popular. She's a household name these days. If you know, she was on Oprah, et cetera, et cetera. And her main areas of research are shame and vulnerability. And what she found when you ask people, when she was asking people to tell her stories of vulnerability, what they actually ended up telling her about were stories of courage, and vice versa. When she asked people about stories of courage, they would tell her stories of vulnerability. Like, for example, a firefighter that risked their lives to save others, a parent that's sacrificing for a child at great cost to themselves. Stories of courage actually reveal both sides of this coin. So there's this duality that exists that we must try to balance. And again, a start to that is balancing this duality internally, in the mind, in our bodies, in our hearts, and within each other. So here we have another example or opportunity to see how vulnerability, courage, resilience, and self-compassion and inner strength are actually synonymous, or at least a part of the same psychological cycle. The second element of self-compassion or inner strength is common humanity. Oftentimes, the mind gets very frustrated when we don't have things the way we want them to be, right? The mind gets entitled, like I mentioned, entitled mind. This can be easily accompanied by an irrational but sometimes pervasive sense of isolation, as if I was the only person on earth suffering or making mistakes. But as we already know, all humans suffer. The very definition of being human means that one is mortal, vulnerable, and imperfect. Therefore, self-compassion involves recognizing that suffering and even personal inadequacy is part of the shared human experience, something that we all go through rather than being something that only happens to me or the self alone. And in that shared humanity, we also have connection. The third element of self-compassion is inner strength is mindfulness. So we talk about mindfulness versus over-identification. Mindfulness requires taking a balanced or depersonalized approach to negative emotions specifically, right? So that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. In this equilibrated stance, we can be further engaged or become engaged by it by relating personal experiences to those of others who are also suffering, right? Kind of going back to that common humanity concept. Also, the purpose of this is to put our situation into a larger perspective. One of the very few times when it's okay or actually doing comparing can be helpful or productive. But this is not meant to be taken to the extreme. It's not meant to minimize or diminish in any way or invalidate feelings or pain or other human experiences. It's just about seeking balance. Mindfulness also stems from a willingness to observe our negative thoughts and emotions with openness and curiosity so that they're held in a mindful awareness. Mindfulness is really considered a non-judgmental, receptive state in which one can observe feelings and thoughts as they are without trying to suppress or deny them, as mentioned earlier. We can't ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time, just like we can't ignore the pain or suffering of others and be simultaneously compassionate for them. Those two things are in conflict, right? Equally, and as mentioned earlier, mindfulness requires that we not be over-identified with thoughts and feelings. So much so, of course, that we end up getting caught up and swept away by negative reactivity. Now, let's be realistic, right? We can't be depersonalized all the time. We're not robots, right? It's normal to get caught up sometimes. But even if you break the pattern of over-identification sometimes, or once, 1 out of 10 times, once a month, anything, this is better than nothing. And it offers the brain an opportunity or an option of doing something different and relating to the self differently. Okay. So those were the 3 aspects, and let's talk about some ways where people get confused around self-compassion. It is not self-indulgence. Oftentimes people say they're reluctant to engage in self-compassion because they're afraid that this would allow them to just get away with anything. And that could sound something like, oof, I'm super stressed today, so I'm going to be really kind to myself and not do anything and watch TV all day and eat ice cream. This, of course, is not self-compassion. This is self-indulgence. Very different, right? The idea here is to remember that being compassionate to oneself means that you want long-term health and happiness, right? And in many cases, just giving yourself mindless pleasure without being intentional around it may actually be harmful to our well-being. Like obvious examples of things like doing drugs, overeating, never moving your body, drinking, excessively, right? So we can engage sometimes in things that are pleasurable, but the point is to be mindful and intentional around it. That is the compassionate way to engage, in being self-compassionate. Because the idea is to create lasting health and happiness. And that does require a certain amount of restraint or even displeasure, such as when we make a choice to move away from damaging habits to, like, for example, quit smoking, or perhaps start a new exercise routine. That's really hard, right? Sometimes, or making more nutritional choices when we eat. Unfortunately, the tendency is for people to be very hard on themselves when they notice something that they want to change, a pattern, right? Because they think they can shame themselves into action. And unfortunately, this self-flagellation approach often backfires, especially when it's so hard to face truths about ourselves because we're too afraid of hating ourselves if we do. So then these areas of weakness or areas of improvement end up being unacknowledged in an unconscious attempt to avoid dealing with any of it. Because of course, these things are scary and uncomfortable, and the mind typically wants to avoid discomfort at all costs. However, in contrast, compassion provides a powerful motivating force for growth and change. And the care that's intrinsic in compassion provides a motivating force for growth and change. And I think the key here is it also provides the psychological safety needed to see the self more clearly without fear of self-condemnation. So another example that I like to throw out there is consider what we know already about the learning environment, right? When we're in schools, we no longer subject children back in the day to crazy drastic means of punishment in school because we know now, based on decades and decades of research, that at this point, creating a shameful learning environment does not result in better learning comprehension. So just like the classroom, it doesn't work in your head. At least that's what the research shows. So if you're thinking of trying to make a change, to change a pattern, especially an internal pattern that was probably created or developed years ago as a result of a natural response to something that was happening at that time, and it worked at that time, it's really important to try to cultivate some patience and understanding and consciousness that that pattern existed for some reason that served you well at that time, again, right? And now perhaps it doesn't serve you as well. And it's time to begin shifting and evolving and considering other options that will serve you better in your current circumstances. And this is absolutely nothing to be ashamed about. In fact, this is exactly how we grow. This is how we evolve and become stronger, more capable human beings. Big differentiation also between self-compassion and self-esteem. Although they may sound similar, they're different in many ways. So let's talk about that. Self-esteem typically refers to our sense of self-worth, right? Our perceived value, or kind of how much we like ourselves, how much we think how cool we are or whatever. And while there is little doubt that definitely having a low self-esteem can be very problematic and leads to things like depression and lack of motivation, trying to have a higher self-esteem can also be problematic depending on how you approach it. In modern Western culture, self-esteem is often based on how much we feel like we stand out or how much we feel we are special. It's not really okay this day and age to consider ourselves average in anything, right? We have to kind of feel above average to feel good about ourselves. And that means that attempts to raise self-esteem may actually result in sort of self-absorbed behavior, self-inflation, right? And then we're also putting others down in order to feel better about ourselves. So we may find ourselves even frustrated or angry or even agitated or aggressive towards people who've said or done things that potentially make us feel bad about ourselves. So this need for high self-esteem may actually encourage us to ignore or distort or hide personal shortcomings. And then we really can't see ourselves clearly. And then that results in an inability to reflect internally and honestly about ourselves on our personal flaws, which then prohibits learning, growth, evolution, right? So self-esteem is really contingent on either like our latest failure or our latest success, meaning it also fluctuates depending on the external, which is ever changing, right? Our external environment is constantly shifting. So in contrast to self-esteem, self-compassion is not based on evaluation and comparing. People feel compassionate towards themselves and others because all human beings deserve compassion and understanding, not because we possess some particular trait, because we're pretty, because we have these types of clothes or this car or whatever. This means that self-compassion that with self-compassion, you don't have to feel better than others in order to feel good about yourself. It also allows for greater clarity because personal feelings can be acknowledged with kindness. They don't need to be hidden. They're not experienced as psychologically threatening. Therefore, they don't necessarily create shame and then need to be psychologically defended against or avoided. Moreover, as you have guessed, self-compassion is certainly not dependent on external circumstances. It's always available. In fact, it's always available, and especially available when you're feeling at your worst. So, and the research shows that in comparison to self-esteem, self-compassion is actually associated with higher levels of emotional resilience, why I refer to them as very similar or the same even, more accurate self-concept or self-evaluation, more caring relationship behaviors, less narcissism, and less reactive anger. Again, which is why I refer to self-compassion as very similar to inner strength and inner courage. Okay, so this picture is from Dr. Kristen Neff and Dr. Chris Germer's Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook. Gives you a good, let you guys kind of take a look at it. It gives you a good sense of the yin and yang of self-compassion, right? Because we know there's duality here, not just in these concepts, but within us, right? We're complicated human beings are super complicated. We're always feeling, even sometimes opposing emotions at the same time. So Dr. Kristen Neff, who wrote a book called Self-Compassion, look her up, actually states that in order to be truly self-compassionate, to be whole, we must integrate both versions of self-compassion, the caring, kind part of us and the fierce, protective, motivating part of us. If we're gentle without ferocity, we risk becoming complacent or disempowered. And if we're fierce without tenderness, we risk becoming hostile, selfish, or even overly perfectionistic. The idea here, the analogy that I like to go with is like a tree with a solid trunk, yet flexible branches. We can stand strong, yet still embrace others as part of an interdependent whole. Okay, what about pandemic and social justice issues? Let's get a little bit into that, right? Wouldn't make sense if we didn't cover that. So let's apply these concepts to what's been going on recently. The idea here is the yang of self-compassion really means taking action to protect or create boundaries and be able to provide and motivate when needed. That means saying no. And a big part of being self-compassionate is creating boundaries, because sometimes we need boundaries, right? We have to be authentic and true to ourselves. It also means giving ourselves what we need mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, really reevaluating that consistently for the self. And particularly under these kinds of circumstances where we're being required to create so much physical distance, we're not seeing each other, our faces are covered. Can you imagine if I did the whole presentation like this? That would be, right? It's a totally different way of interacting with other humans. So, and we're literally we're literally not seeing each other. So that means really slowing down and asking questions around what we need to get through this time. So if we can sit with our feelings, acknowledge, check in with ourselves about what our needs are, check in with ourselves with how we are interacting with our community, what we're seeing in our community that feels like is calling our attention, we can create create balance between these two parts of us that need nurturing and also need to engage externally and protect and potentially be fierce and protective and proactive. This balanced perspective allows us to take action from a motivated and nurtured self, right? So that we avoid things like burnout that we're also seeing a ton of these days. So we're allowed, this gives us the state to be able to create change within our communities, our family units, or maybe just internally for ourselves. Hopefully that explains a little bit about both. I love this picture. It's very moving. This has been floating around the internet for quite some time, and I thought it was very applicable. Ultimately, when we're engaging in self-compassion, inner courage, right? What are the things that we may need to consider letting go of? Maybe it's really about rewriting the narrative. What's the narrative that you have in your head about something? Can you let go of shame? Can you let go of blame? These psychological states that create resistance and avoidance. Because how can we be connected and create movement in things and achievement in things and improving relationships and evolving to our highest self if we're in shame, if we're blaming, if we're fearful of being vulnerable? These states really trick us into thinking we're psychologically safe and protected, but the only thing that's actually really happening is that it's creating this illusion of protection, this illusion of separateness and distance. So let's get into some practicing options because all that stuff is really heavy. Let's talk about how do we cultivate, right? What are some activities that we can do? So I have a couple of examples, and I'll get into some demonstrations too. Hopefully that'll be fine. So the acronym RAIN was originally created by Michelle McDonald. She was a senior Buddhist teacher, and she had it as recognize, allow, investigate, and non-identification. Now you know what non-identification is. However, Tara Brach, who is a psychologist, she actually got her doctorate here in California. She's the founder of the Insight Meditation Community now in Washington, D.C. She's written several books. I highly encourage you to Google her. She's fantastic. She has a website with lots of meditation, video teachings, offerings on every possible topic you can imagine. And I really like to follow her example of what RAIN is. And you can also look this up on her website. Oops, sorry, I skipped a slide. She has the R as recognize still, and recognize really means label or identifying, right? So another researcher, Dan Siegel, who's the author of Whole Brain Child, he likes to say, name it to tame it. Because when we label something and name something, that creates a different relationship with it. We're not as caught up. We've already created a little bit of observation. We're observing ourselves, right? So that gives us the space to interact with it differently. The A is for allow, to let life be just as it is versus arguing with reality, right? We oftentimes, the mind, going back to entitled mind, wants things to show up, wants life to be the way the mind wants it to be, wants the green lights, wants people to not be angry or sad, whatever, wants people to show up the way we want them to be instead of the way they are, right? So part of engaging in self-compassion is recognizing what's happening, allowing things to be as they are so that we can approach and at least question, because that's the next step, investigate. Can you investigate with gentle attention? I like to say curiosity. Can you be curious around what's happening? Questioning helps us open the mind's eye to options, again, that, like I've mentioned, that were perhaps unavailable when you were previously caught up and swept away in a pattern of interacting. And the last is nurture. Again, like we've covered, asking what might be needed, what steps could be taken towards healing. One of the ways that I really like to talk about this is, can you imagine what you would do for yourself if you got hurt? You fell or you cut yourself or something, whatever, your arm started swelling. You know, we're not necessarily putting our physical ailments behind our backs and pretending they don't exist. No, we're looking at them, we're acknowledging that something's wrong. Okay, cut my hand, it's bleeding. The blood is a sign I need to do something. I need to wrap it. I need to put a Band-Aid. I need to run it under some water. I need to elevate my, basically we're looking at it, we're assessing it, we're seeing if there are, checking in with various options. And then even if we're not medical professionals, we're taking some steps towards healing. And it's the same with our feelings and our emotions. Additional ways that we can engage in cultivating inner compassion or courage and resilience is a meta meditation. So the meta meditation is, we start with the micro and we move into the macro. So this is an example that I have up on the screen. It's going to sound something like, may I be filled with loving kindness. May I be free from suffering. May I be well. May I be at peace. And then we move to the other. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be at peace. May you be well. May you be free from suffering. And then we move into the community. May all beings be free from suffering, be filled with loving kindness, etc. The mason jar activity is, reach over here really quick, is hopefully good. Yeah, I think if I keep it in front of me. So maybe you can kind of see this. If I put my, maybe you can see that my fingers are back here and you can see there's some clarity, right? So this is the mason jar that's filled with water. I'm going to show you in a minute. It's also got some sparkles, some sparkles in it. And so what happens, can we see kind of clearly through this? I mean, it's not great because it's a jar, but you can kind of see through it, right? So now if I shake it up, chance of seeing clearly through it, maybe this is hard for you all to see, but chance of seeing through it with all these sparkles and sprinkles is a little bit more complicated. And so this jar is like the mind, right? It's an analogy for the mind, that when you're really activated, when you're in your feelings about something, when your thoughts are racing, how are we going to be decision making when we can't see clearly here? We have to allow for things to settle. We have to allow for the activation to pass. And after a while, this will settle and it'll go back to being clear. And that's the state of mind we want to cultivate as often as possible, especially for decision making. So this is a fun little activity. You can just pick any mason jar, fill it with water. Mine's like a little bit of purple because I put a little bit of dye in it. And I just dumped a bunch of sprinkles in it and a tiny bit of, if you can find either sparkle glue or gelatin, and it will hold, it's already kind of going down. So I'm already diminishing the level of agitation that's in the jar. And it's just a nice reminder of how the mind works sometimes. A writing activity. So I wouldn't be the quintessential therapist if I didn't recommend journaling. So there is science behind that. It's not just because we think journaling is fun. It's because there is a brain activation that happens, right? So when you write things down, you're engaging with a different part of your brain. You're engaging your emotions. And Dan Siegel, the author of Whole Brain Child, he really likes to talk about this as integration. So you're literally helping your brain connect to itself, right? You're creating the neurotransmitters that are wiring differently instead of only processing in the emotional part of the brain. You're engaging other parts of your brain, right? So writing is really different. If you think to yourself, I don't know, an extreme example, I hate my life, versus when you write, I hate my life. Like, then you start to go, wait, really? Am I really saying I hate? Okay, well, maybe there's some parts, right? And maybe we can start to see things differently. When you engage the brain that way, it is very useful. And Dan Siegel really talks about, you have a more integrated perspective of what's happening. The last activity that I'm going to talk about in order to help cultivate compassion is called gentle touch. And this is also from Kristen Neff, who was the researcher that I mentioned in the yin yang. She has identified various hand movements that you can do because we're mammals and we respond to touch, and that means even yourself, right? So the 7 different things that you can do, I think there's 7, are these various hand movements. I'll try to show you, even though I'm sitting and you all can only see me from here. So it's touching your face with both hands. One hand. Both hands over your chest or over your heart in a way that feels comfortable for you. Yeah, you all can do it now. One hand. And just taking a moment when you do it, right? A fist and a hand over your fist, which she calls fierce compassion, which I love. So a fist and a hand over on your tummy, both hands, one hand, or a just open, sort of opened hand, palm, like 2 hands together in your lap. You're not gonna be able to see my lap, but like this, open, or closed. And just taking a moment to do this for yourself, right? Like back in the day when we used to drive, some of us are in hybrid schedules. I'm not quite there yet. But when I used to drive to work and feeling, sometimes people feel agitated in traffic, right? I would just, you know, you can do this without anybody noticing. And you're giving yourself a moment of compassion. And your physiological response will shift when there's agitation, right? Because agitation is a physiological response. We respond also physiologically, right? Okay, let's review. So we talked about inner strength, courage, vulnerability, lots of self-compassion. We talked about the 3 components: kindness, common humanity, mindfulness. We talked about some of the things that often get misconstrued and how self-compassion sometimes gets confused with other things, right? And we talked about fierce compassion, being empowered, the duality that exists. And we talked about activities, a handful of activities. There's the RAIN. Do we remember what RAIN stands for? Recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. You guys saw the mason jar. And some actual hand activities, writing, engaging the brain. Engaging the brain. Writing is one example, right? You can do yoga, you can do all kinds of things. So here are some references. I know I'm going to slide through this really quick, but ultimately this is, you know, some resources that I utilize and resources that I recommend. Of course, I'm putting my email up. If there are any of these concepts that you're curious around or want to discuss further, I would be very happy to do so at any time. Of course, you can all email me directly. So here's to a more courageous and maybe connected you in 2022. That's what I have. Maybe we have some questions because I'm at like 43, 45 minutes, right, Linda?
Yes, we do have some questions. I've been watching them in the chat. And question 1 is, and I'll put it in the chat. It comes from Mike, and it was around the slide that you had around biological and neurological, slide 4.
Yes.
And the question is, does our reliance on heuristics as a survival mechanism serve as such a steel gate to our perception that compassion is difficult to attain?
Well, I don't know if it's just the reliance on that. I mean, I think there's several factors that are compiled in, you know, our society has just moved drastically away from this. And I don't know if we're really ever taught this, right? And I'm going to say culturally, this looks very different in different cultures, right? So like we see cultures, like actually a lot of these concepts are Buddhist concepts. And so culturally, this is really, really different. You know, we live in a culture, you know, arguably that is very, very even more so than it was like decade after decade after decade. We keep seeing more pressure on the individual, right? Even if we think about the family unit, like the family unit is now so siloed, right? And maybe part of this is like, I don't want to get too into it, but like commercialization, like right now we have to pay for childcare. We used to live in communities. And so we're really very removed from a lot of, you know, previous ways where people used to be significantly more interconnected. And again, I'm going to speak primarily towards Western culture because other cultures still have a lot of, you know, communal sharing, and so there's a little bit of dichotomy here that I think exists, which ends up contributing to this lack of self-compassion. So I think it's a big, broad, it's not one thing. Does that make sense?
All right, thank you. And then another question we have time for. It is from Mike. And the question is about the RAIN model on slide 14 that you showed.
Yes.
And in that slide, you talked about allowance. So the question is about the contrast between allowance and questioning. And if Mike wants to elaborate on that, Mike, you can feel free to unmute yourself too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Linda.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful content. Great stuff. I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to add some clarity regarding the question. Yeah, I just thought, so allowance while questioning, and I thought there's kind of like an inherent contradiction in terms of trying to figure out why it's happening while supposed to be allowing it to happen. I just wanted to get your thoughts in terms of that
Yeah.
dynamic.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, let's definitely clarify that. Okay, so I would say I would actually keep them separated, right? So so recognizing would be identifying, labeling. Allowing would be letting it exist as it is. We're not necessarily trying to fight against it, because questioning, when you're questioning something, that doesn't necessarily mean you're creating resistance to it. You're just you're looking at it as it exists without interacting with it. You're just being curious around it. So I'll give you an example. Okay, I have a 6-year-old. So my 6-year-old's times, his behavior shows that, I mean, I'm very blessed with very, well-behaved, lovely children, majority of the time. But, they're kids, so they can be challenging at times. And, I can go into my head and say, well, I wish, just don't be doing blah, 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 whatever it is, right? And so I can fight against that, but I can also accept that it is existing right now. Or I should say, right? So my kid shows up and is, I don't know, acting silly, acting crazy. Maybe we're at a restaurant, we're trying to get something done, or maybe we're trying to get out the house. And I can engage with what is happening right now. And maybe in a moment of where I'm like calm and zen, I say, I really see that you're super activated right now. You're needing to get some energy out, but I'm trying to get us downstairs and out of the house into the garage. Can we make some time for you to play when we get back from the store or dinner or whatever? Versus I engage and say, right now, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Why can't you just, and then go down that road? Does that highlight the difference a little bit better? Okay. I saw you say yeah, even though I didn't hear it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Terrific. Thank you. We have time for at least one more question. And that, I put it in the chat. The question that we have is about self-compassion. You talked about that. There's a slide where there's a contrast between the idea of self-esteem and self-compassion.
Mhm.
And I got a message about wanting that idea of self-compassion to get more attention. So where do you see this idea of self-compassion meeting roadblocks and getting traction? With that idea of, hey, how can we recognize that this is becoming more accepted, or how can we promote it to be more accepted?
In terms of, is that being asked of me in terms of like society wise or
Yeah, your observations of maybe how do we recognize it getting traction?
yes.
And where, and if it's not getting traction, where are those roadblocks coming from?
Yes, excellent question. So I don't know if I'm going to have a good answer for this other than to say, this is something that is a calling for me. It's like, I feel like it's my life's work, right? Like I'm bringing this to UC San Diego population because when I was exposed to it, I was like, we have to have this here. Like people got to know about this. And I felt compelled to do a training on it. And this is a compilation of not just one training that I've taken, but like trainings and books and classes, right? Like so, the more I think we talk about this, right? So this is a step in, I have conversations with people one-on-one, and these trainings are a way that I'm certainly trying to change the conversation, right? We've been sort of inoculated with this kind of idea of self-esteem and kind of creating differences and comparing. And I mean, just comparing is a normal thing for the brain. But when you get introduced to self-compassion and you see it and you compare it to self-esteem, you go, oh, right, like these light bulbs go off. Hopefully you all had some light bulb moments when we're talking about these concepts, like, oh yeah, now I see what's the difference. And it's not necessarily, I'm not trying to advocate one way better than the other, but it's just about an increased consciousness and balance around it. So ultimately my answer to that question is I'm trying to disseminate that information as much as possible. And hopefully now with you all taking this training, you all start to integrate in small ways and then start to have conversations in your lives with people, and look for the information, because it's out there. The research is out there. The body of research on self-compassion right now is really growing. I mean, I even took a training on the neurobiology of compassion, right? That's how I got it. I pulled a smidge of slide from that. But it's really coming up in the research, and more and more scientific evidence showing. So, I would say I'm certainly trying to connect people to this information. And now that you all have it, hopefully you all can connect more, and we can just continue growing this this conversation as much as possible. And with every generation, hopefully that keeps improving.
Thank you. I have one last question, and it's from Aman Agrama, and I'll ask her to unmute herself so she can ask you directly.
Thanks, Linda. And thanks for making time. So, we were talking about resilience and strength and some of that internal stuff as well. And I've always considered myself a pretty resilient person, and actually even found it like a compliment when people would say like, "Oh, Iman, you're so resilient." Like, oh my gosh. And then I read this thing on Instagram, this woman of color that I follow, and I was like, whoa. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read it.
Sure.
And I want to hear what you think, and like, so she quotes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And then she says, yeah, nah, nope, no. I don't find comfort in resilience. I find it utterly annoying that I get a cute compliment about it, yet there's no accountability from people or systemic pillars that make life difficult in the first place. I'm stronger with support, love, resources, and being poured into. I'm not stronger being consistently beaten. My character isn't better. It becomes guarded, anxious, weary, and angry. And that just resonated for me. I was like, oh my God, like that's how I feel about being resilient, like feeling guarded and anxious and weary and very angry, actually. So just wanting to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that's a totally valid experience. I hear that. And at the same time, can we hold, so the question that I would have for her around that is, I hear the need for a decreased level of adversity, right? We want to decrease the adversity that we're facing in so many areas. And so it brings me back to that slide on the yin and yang, and on the interacting with reality, on how it's showing up. I can't change in the immediacy how someone's showing up. I can only recognize how I'm interacting with them. So if someone is showing up, or if a system is showing up in a way that I feel is, I'm going to use the word unjust. Okay. I need to take care of myself so that I can interact with it in a way that feels sustainable for me. So if I am interacting with systems that are constantly creating adversity for me, I need to do what I need. It's my responsibility to do what I need to do to take care of myself, and then re-engage. So I'm wondering if she's expressing burnout, right? And so when anybody's expressing burnout, what I want to say to that is, let's make sure we're engaging with these systems and taking care of ourselves. Because it sounds like maybe, we're all, there's so much, burnout's pervasive, right? It's just everywhere. And so how do we make advocacy and work towards social justice issues sustainable? The only answer that I have to that is by doing nurturing for the self. That's how we can keep coming back. Because if we don't nurture to the self, we're going to get angry. We're going to keep getting angry. And I don't know how, anger can certainly has its place in productivity, right? Anger creates a lot of movement. It's very productive. If anger starts to move towards resentment, or, everybody has to sort of navigate that line for themselves. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I read it more from, definitely she refers to like the systems, but the way it resonated for me is when other people will like say like, oh, you're so resilient, instead of like offering support. Does that make sense? And especially like people that I felt, you know, maybe are
Oh,
even
yes.
perpetuating some of these, you
Yes.
know, harms, right? Like
Yes.
harms that come from a system that we're in, right? That we can't control necessarily. We can keep working towards and finding justice and such. But like that's how I read it, and I was like, oh wow. And I it kind of hit me because I was like, I do get like, I feel like, oh wow, like I was complimented, I was told I was resilient, and then at the same time I'm like, I have this conflict. So I'm like, it doesn't
Yes.
feel like a compliment. Like it feels like almost like a hang in there. We're gonna keep treating you like crap, or like, you know, but hang in there, Iman, you know. So I guess that's where it comes from
I hear
me.
you.
I totally hear everything that you're saying. I agree with 100%, and that's, you know, where I found my ways of like self-care and all of that, right? And like
Yes.
resilience in that, and like resilience in the demanding the need for it. But it's more of like when you're told you're resilient by people who are kind of perpetuating the harm, like,
Yes.
like I guess, how do you respond? Or like, I don't know, like I was more wondering perspective on.
I hear you. Okay, I hear you. Sorry. So yeah, so under those circumstances, it's really important to, oh, we're done. We're just so sorry. Okay, so Iman, I'm so
You
so
can, you can have your final thoughts.
okay, yeah, so under those circumstances, the opportunity here, because what is within your, I encourage people to think about what's within your control. So in a situation where someone's saying something to you and you're interpreting it, what's within your control is how you receive it. So we can't change that they're saying something that is kind of maybe has this duality, but certainly what it would be like, okay, can you stay with it that moment? Or, I mean, maybe you're not doing this in the immediacy, you're thinking about it afterwards, but can you stay with that and go, what do I need to say to this person to help me feel like, hey, you know, like, don't think you're getting away with this with me. And like, just because all this is happening over here and, you know, there's some, right, like there's some perpetuating that's happening. I'm aware, and what boundary needs to be, and then do you verbally set up a boundary? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I like that. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Izabel. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for being our kickoff speaker for our first season, first episode. That is all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank those who joined us live for the Learning Boost series. If you have questions after the talk, of course, you can send us an email at staffeducation@ucsd.edu. For those joining us live, I've also attached a bonus Zoom background for you to keep and use, and I've given you links to register for our next 2 sessions. In closing, we will remind everyone that the UC San Diego Learning Boost series is here for you to learn, to give you a small and mighty learning boost, to leverage, to inspire you to leverage inspiration into bite-sized risk-taking, and to lead the way towards richer, more meaningful conversations. Remember, you are the connection point between an idea and a philosophy and a practice. With that, thank you so much, Izabel. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.